So we're going to put our first card together, and the first one we're going to do is this one here with the die cuts. So what I want to do is decide before I start to put anything together how you want to do the snow. So you can do snow with a stencil and some paste. If it's texture paste, you're going to want to do it after the fact. If it's a gel medium that is glossy, it's going to repel the distress ink that we're going to use. So you're going to want to do that. You can do that ahead of time and then let it dry. The other option is using some paint and a splatter brush. You want to make sure that your paint has a glossy finish though, so the distress that we are going to put on the background will be resisted by the paint. If you have a matte finish, then you're going to need to do it afterwards. And the reason we need to decide this ahead of time is because when I made this card, I wanted to glue all of the pieces on first, then do my distress background, and then I realized that the paint that I was using had a little bit of a matte finish, so it was catching some of the distress, and rather than ending up white, it was ending up a little bit darker than the color of my distress. So I'm going to do it a little bit different for this card that I'm showing you. I am going to stamp and emboss some snowflakes, and this stamp here is from this set. This set, I'm going to show you. The next card that we're going to do is going to be a watercolor version, so you don't have to just do this card with stamps, or sorry, with dies. You can also do it with stamps. So this set I'm going to use for the next version of the card, and this snow is from this set. So we are going to stamp and emboss all of the pieces ahead of time. I'm going to just tuck them aside, grab a scrap piece of paper to work on, and I'm going to do each one at a time. There's no point in trying to do more than one, because that is going to be how I'm going to end up getting in trouble and messing up my embossing. So I'm just using Versamark. You can use whatever type of embossing ink that you like. I'm going to stamp, put my powder down, tap off the excess, and as long as you like what you see, you can start embossing. So I'm using a heat gun here to emboss. And since it's white on white, it's probably pretty hard to see the difference between the two, but here's an example of what it looked like ahead of time. So I'm going to stamp here. Normally I'd put my embossing powder back in the container between doing this, but I knew that I had enough on there. So that is what it looks like before I emboss it, and this is what it looks like afterwards. So before time, it is quite matte, and you can see the granules of the embossing powder, and then afterwards, the embossing is shiny and it's been melted by the heat gun. Now, if you haven't embossed before, you need a heat gun to do it. You need one that's suitable for embossing. A hairdryer will not work, because a hairdryer is just going to blow air. A heat gun emits heat. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to emit the heat and melt the powder rather than blowing it. If we blow it, we're just going to dry the ink and we're going to end up blowing the powder right off of our piece. So we're going to emboss this one now. You'll also notice that when I'm embossing it, I am moving my paper around, but I'm moving it around slowly. I want to be watching and making sure that my embossing powder is melting and not just moving. I want to make sure that embossing powder is melting before I move it to the next section. So for this bigger one here, I'm probably going to need to stamp it more than once. If you're more comfortable to stamp it, emboss it, and then do the next section, you can absolutely do that. I've done embossing enough times that I'm quite comfortable just stamping it and doing it. But especially if you're new to it and have a hard time seeing exactly where that ink is, you may want to just stamp it, emboss it, and then do the next section. You'll also want to make sure that when you're embossing, you're keeping your heat gun about an inch, 2 inches away from, away from your paper. If you keep your heat gun in one area for too long, you can burn your paper, and we don't want that for sure. We want to keep it a safe distance away, and also aim it away from your hand. We don't want to burn ourselves, and it is possible to burn yourself. Well, really, it gets too hot before you can burn yourself, but definitely have it pointed away from your hand. And then I have one more here to emboss. Very last step, I'm going to emboss the sentiment on here. So you want to make sure that the sentiment you are using is smaller than that piece of paper that you are embossing it on. Otherwise, make different plans. If you have a sentiment that's bigger than that, you could do it on one of these bigger pieces, or if possible, divide it between a few of the panels. But I chose the one, or I chose one that is small enough to fit on the panel, and this one is actually from this set here, because the set that I'm using for the watercolor is actually a little bit, the sentiments on there a little bit, no, there's no sentiments on there. I have 3 different sets here that I'm looking at. So I'm going to put my ink on there, center it in place, and because we've got such a tiny piece of paper, we want to make sure to be a little bit careful that when we get the powder on here, we are not touching it. So flick the excess off very carefully. You can do it a little bit from the back, but we definitely want to make sure that we have any excess bits of embossing powder off of there. And then I'm going to emboss the one side facing the heat gun away, and then I'm going to emboss this side while I'm holding the opposite. Done. Heat gun is heated up now, so it's embossing quite a bit faster. There we go. And I stamped that white on white. I'm going to be doing the distressed background, so it's going to resist the ink, and it's going to end up showing up a lot more than it does right there. So I've got all of my embossing done. One more thing, this metal part, because it's a heat gun, it gets very, very hot, so don't touch it once you've started embossing. Set it aside to dry and cool. And we've got all of our embossing done, and then in the next video we're going to start to layer our pieces on there, and then we're going to do the distressed background once everything is glued to it. We'll see you in the next video.